If you haven't done so, feel free to grab a bolla, and there should be some coffee, and then the cups are right under. So getting late in the afternoon. All right. Well, I will. We're at time, and I'm sure some people will continue popping online in the next couple of minutes. But I will get us started by saying welcome to this workshop on charting desirable energy futures, where we're discussing the co-production of actionable knowledge in terms of for whom it's co-produced, how it's co-produced, and why. On screen, first of all, I should say we have Shayan Shokrgozar, who's led this initiative to put this together. So welcome. We have Kavya Michael, who's gracing us with one of the two talks that give us lots of fun stuff to engage with, really inspiring work. I will talk you through both the speakers in terms of a short bio and a blurb of their talks. And we also have joining us, hopefully quite soon, Carlos Vernel, whom I will also introduce when that happens. But as we're warming up, I will say a couple of things about the sort of premise of the workshop itself. Unconventional. I should also say that I'm Siddharth Sareen. I'm also based at SET doing energy social science, and also based at the University of Stavanger. So unconventional energy deployment is reshaping institutions, sectors, and societies. Positive aspects include substantial emissions reductions compared to conventional sources, prosumerism, and the emergence of ownership models like energy communities. Here comes the but. However, oversight in socially and politically contested areas has led to socioecologically harmful consequences. Despite challenges, transitioning from fossil fuels to cleaner alternatives is crucial for enhancing social cohesion and ecological well-being and combating climate change. This prompts the question, how can academia promote energy visions and practices that foster well-being for both humans and other than human entities within planetary limits? Existing research highlights the need for a broader socio-political perspective. Neglected areas deserving attention include the role of care work, drawing inspiration from feminist scholarship, and the significance of alternative energy epistemologies and ontologies, drawing from post-development in shaping future energy scenarios. So I should say that some of our engagement on this comes from the Accountable Solar Energy Transitions project, which we've been running for the past 2-3 years, and which is entering its closing phase now, looking at the governance of solar energy at multiple scales in financially constrained contexts like Portugal and Rajasthan. But we're very pleased to have with us two colleagues to help us think through some of these things who come in not from the project, but based on their contributions to a body of work that bears close resemblances and has strong resonance with some of the things that our work's been bringing us towards. I still do not see Carlos with us. Shayan, I think I'll go ahead and introduce him if that's all right. Do you think we should continue? Yeah. Just mindful of keeping within time. So our first speaker today is Carlos Vernel, who holds a PhD in human geography from Bergen University. His research interests revolve around the decolonization of concepts such as energy and justice. He's been active in attempting to decenter the state and modernity from these conceptualizations in both social and academic contexts. He's worked with civil society organizations and social movements for over a decade. As of last year, Carlos is part of the facilitation team of the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, and also participates in the National Strategic Program on Climate Change and Energy, developed by CONAHCYT in Mexico. So I will not give you an overview of the talk, but also introduce Kavya. Kavya Michael, who's on screen with us, is an environmental social scientist with expertise in analyzing the natural environment, in quotes, through a social science lens, and I should say is based at Chalmers University in Gothenburg. Her research and professional experience broadly lie in examining global environmental change and energy-related issues through human rights and justice lens. Within this domain, questions of class, caste, and gender have been central to her analysis. She also studies the multiple intersections of climate change / environmental hazards, urban inequality, informality, and intra-regional migration, with a special focus on the Global South. The current work examines how the various structural elements of gender injustices and the resultant forms of exclusion in different sectorial contexts interact with the impacts of climate change, as well as with climate action and energy transitions across the globe. There we have two very good people to think with. And how we've structured this is that starting about now, we will ease into two talks, 20-25 minutes each. That will take us through some of the provocations that that undergird this workshop. And then we'll see quite an active bunch of people online. So we will have Shayan lead us through questions and comments that come up from there. And we also have a handful of people here in the room with us who will be welcome. They can hear you online from where you're sitting, but you're very welcome to also come over to the screen. I will not do funny things with turning around cameras because it's up there and things are a bit delicately poised as we ease into the hybrid hosting capabilities of this relatively recent location for the set center. And then by the time we approach an hour and a half, we will also wrap up day 0. So with that, I think since Carlos has not yet popped up on screen, I will invite you, Kavya, to get us started.
Thank you, Sid. Let me just try to share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yeah. If you go on to full screen, it would probably be easier for us to see here.
Yeah, I'm just going to the
Yeah,
presentation.
perfect.
Great. So thank you so much, Shayan and Sid, for inviting me today. So yeah, let me start from a very fundamental statement that climate change is inequality. So, be it in terms of how it was caused, the distribution of its effects, or what we see now in the name of climate action and energy transitions. So, there are entrenched notions of political and economic inequalities that you see everywhere in the fossil fuel based energy systems. And we also see that decision making power and control, they're historically huge. Within the transition regime, what often happens is this dominant patterns of privilege and exclusion, the various forces at work, colonial patriarchal hierarchies, they seem to replicate, or there is a tendency that these can replicate in the transitions process as well. However, the problem with energy transitions now is that it's often seen as very abstract from the ongoing social realities and the experiences of people who are actually undergoing transitions. So, this is where we also look at alternate visions of energy transitions. So, the fundamental issue here is that solutions are often imagined and created within the structures that created the climate crisis in the first place. So now we think about issues of justice when we talk about questions of transitions. So we see two major problems when you talk about transitions. One is, of course, the delay in promoting effective action, the profits that are still flowing to the fossil fuel based capitalism, and why effective action is delayed. However, another trap is the language of speed and urgency, which is, of course, important, and it is the need of the hour that we have urgent transitions. But this whole idea of speed and urgency also leads to underplaying of equity and justice issues. So when we think about the question of time of transitions, we need to think about how quick and who bears the cost of it and whose time are we talking about. So the mainstream visions of transitions, the techno-economic visions, they often ignore, questions of gender and power as fringe areas. It's not something that's necessarily considered in mainstream dialogues. And especially in the global south, which is also the majority world, there are a lot of instances where many of these historically embedded gendered norms could replicate itself. However, if you look at literature on gender and energy transitions, you still see the same old narrative of virtue and vulnerability playing out with, the imageries of energy poor, vulnerable women in the global north. And, also placing agency, in the global south, and also placing agency in the global north, where you talk about women as better environment managers, women having a lesser carbon emission production, and things like that. So, the problem with these imageries is that it deflects attention from how gender is embedded within the socio-economic and cultural context, and how these homogenizations actually divert attention from the underlying power dynamics. So the literature still remains largely dominated by Western conceptualizations and Western epistemologies. So a lot of action that's taking place on the ground, community-based action, grassroots level movements, they all do not get the necessary attention or visibility in spaces of decision making. So as a part of a project that I'm involved in, where we map the landscape on gender and energy transitions, we still found that majority of the literature is having a dominant techno-economic perspectives. And even in bodies of work that are actually talking about energy poverty and energy justice, it still does not have an enough focus on power relations. So when we're thinking about justice while transitioning, I also would like to emphasize that there are different scales and layers of justice. So there's of course the idea of historic debt and how the minority world has encroached upon the carbon space of the majority world. However, it's also very important to understand that actors who ask or claim for justice in international forums can deny it nationally or locally. Uh, there are many examples from a lot of majority world countries which claim for carbon space at national level, but actively deny it within their countries. So it's very important to understand the nuances also when we think about justice while transitioning. Now, but I don't think everything is, a doomsday tale. And so I believe that transitions also provide a huge opportunity, an opportunity for transformation, where there's a possibility to think about alternate visions of organizing our energy systems, of organizing the ways in which we live and communicate. So there are indeed a lot of emerging alternate visions of energy transitions. So one specific lens that I'm going to engage with a lot today is the lens of care. So energy social sciences research is now increasingly talking about care relations. So care brings about a relational understanding of energy, and these relations are, based on relations of dependence and interdependence. It also gives a lot of attention to unequal power relations, the gendered norms that are surrounding it. So it's often talked about that it is the invisible infrastructure of care or social reproduction which actually upholds the current system, yet it remains really, really invisible. So the case study that I'm going to talk about today, the case of Sola Mamas in Barefoot College Zanzibar, I tried to analyze the case through an integrated framing of care and epistemic justice. This is also to understand how technology and energy transitions are also deeply embedded within the socio-economic and cultural settings. So before I go into the actual case itself, I would like to present a very simple framework where I kind of try to relate care and epistemic injustice. So here I have used the concept of epistemic injustice as propounded by Miranda Fricker. So she talks about two dimensions of epistemic injustice: testimonial injustice and hermeneutical injustice. So, first of all, you know that there is a lot of gendered norms surrounding care work. So, specifically trying to bring care work into the domain of energy and looking at gendered norms there, you see that especially in the majority world or the global south, women's role often gets restricted to provisioning of energy use at household level. However, it's their role as active agents in the energy supply chain is not really imagined. So this unpaid labor, the knowledge and the experience that women have, they are often dismissed. They're not really perceived as technically intelligible. So, as a result, what happens is their voices do not get enough credibility in decision making spaces related to energy. So, the two dimensions of testimonial epistemic injustice. Testimonial injustice is actually when your testimony is not considered credible, when you are excluded in your capability as a knower. Hermeneutical injustice is the lack of collective interpretive ability of the community. This could actually result in the women themselves or the community members restricting their role as carers in the household or just as users of energy and not beyond that. So, this is how I kind of try to relate care work and epistemic injustice. It's also to emphasize the fact that care work is not a problem that can be solved by technology or bringing women just into the employment or just providing income for women. So it's very important that the devaluation of care work and associated knowledges uh, are acknowledged and acted upon. So this is exactly what Barefoot College in Zanzibar tried to do with the Solar Mamas program. Uh, Sorry. Yeah. So the story of Barefoot College actually dates back to India in Tilonia in Rajasthan, where Barefoot College first opened its door. The program became so successful that it spread to different parts of the world, and women from all across the globe in the majority world started coming to Barefoot College in India to get training. So there were 13 women from Zanzibar who were getting trained when the president of Zanzibar visited Barefoot College in 2015. He was so impressed with the working of the program that he decided to set up Barefoot College in Zanzibar. And he appointed these 13 women who were trained as solar engineers to be solar master trainers and to further train women in Zanzibari rural villages as solar engineers. So the program works on the criteria that any women in the rural remote areas who are selected based on community meetings above the age of 35, they can be trained as solar engineers. So the process goes like this. First, the villages are identified where it has to be electrified, and then a team which consists of not just Barefoot College members but representatives from the revolutionary government of Zanzibar goes together with the Barefoot College members to villages, and there they call for community meetings where all members of the community are invited. And then there is a process where the solar master trainers, the government representatives, and the college staff, they kind of explain the benefits of the solar engineering training program to the community members, and they ask for volunteers. So, what often happens, or a big challenge that they face, is that despite signing contracts and despite selecting the solar mamas to be trained based on community consensus on the day of the training, given the patriarchal norms and rigid structures in Zanzibar, there is often instances where the women back out of the training because of their partners not agreeing or other male members in the family. So something remarkable that happens here at this time is that the government of Zanzibar steps in. They actually involve in a process of conscientizing the male members. So, it's also an understanding that women empowerment does not happen by trying to empower women alone. It's also that the community has to be on board and norms have to shift. So the government involves in this process of conscientization, and this is primarily the first stage of the training, the pre-training stage of the training program. And remember that these women are also not formally schooled. So when the actual training program starts, the training is actually through hands-on experiences, images, and color codes. So the idea behind this barefoot college is also that technology should be demystified, and the notions around who's an expert and who's not an expert should be questioned. So along with this solar engineer training, there's an amazing module called Enrich module, and this module actually focuses on helping these women to unlearn a lot of gendered norms and social practices. So this happens through picture cards and images displayed to women. And instead of trying to impose anything from a top down manner, they try to facilitate a discussion among the different stakeholders present there on what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. So, Enrich actually becomes a deliberative space where these women who are being trained as solar engineers talk about various notions of gender and social norms. And based on my interviews and also experiences of the college staff members, what I have realized is that this enrich module actually plays a key role in the success of the program, because a lot of notions around gendered norms and a lot of questions regarding agency get reformulated here. There's a lot of unlearning that is happening, and I think side by side development of women's critical agency. So there's also a lot of modules that talk about rights, reproductive health, training for financial inclusion, opening bank accounts, how to create a saving habit, and all kind of entrepreneurship training. So it's a complete package which goes side by side with the solar engineer training program. And there's also some kind of alternate options or income generation activities, including beekeeping and sewing. So this is just to supplement their income as solar engineers. Now, what happens after the training is that these women who are trained as solar engineers, so which in a way can be considered as the disadvantage with the program, is that they have to stay back in the villages where they came from, and do service to the community, that is basically act as solar engineers, installing panels and also being responsible for maintenance and repair. So the entire cost of this process is borne by the revolutionary government of Zanzibar. There's also a monitoring and evaluation program where the solar mamas from one village actually monitor the program in other villages. So In all these processes, the support of the college, the support of the revolutionary government of Zanzibar is crucial. So, if you look at the whole program through through a care lens, what do we see? So we see a lot of aspects where gendered norms are challenged. So women's role from previously being energy users have now become energy producers, and they've entered into the energy supply chain. So their roles, when imagined as care providers at the household level, they were invisible and not acknowledged. But now their role has transformed to that of community carers. Now, I talk about it as community caregiving because this is also not just a pure commercial transaction. It's that the women are staying back in the villages for the rest of their life and acting as solar engineers, and they're not necessarily leaving the village. So there's a lot of shift in power relations and gendered norms that has happened after the training and when the women actually function as solar engineers within the village communities. So I would like to just go through a few quotes which I thought was interesting. These were interview excerpts from interviews with the solar mamas, so who talked about how the class was very practical, and people who have gone to school for years, they were amazed at what we could do. Also how it changed gendered norms, even within families, where there was one woman who was changing, who spoke that now my husband is also actually helping me in cooking, or that they've changed. I have an increased role in decision making. So something that was previously seen as a male domain, supply of electricity, and now the communities depended on these solar mamas for opening up their businesses late in the hour. So this has essentially led to a shift in power dynamics and dilution, or at least troubling of gendered norms, as Butler calls it. So here I'm again trying to bring together the two lenses that we talked about: care and how do you address the epistemic exclusion. So there are different layers of care or different types of care that you see here. How the solar mama's role changes from caregivers at home to community caregivers. You also see how gendered norms surrounding care have changed, but the state and the college also plays a crucial role here in defining the ability to care of the solar mamas. So the whole process actually helps to understand or visibilize care relations in decentralized energy systems. So when we are talking about locally led transitions and decentralized energy systems, again this is going to involve a lot of notions of care, including ideas about care for technology, which where it could be various actors getting involved in the whole process. Side by side, if we look at the lens of epistemic injustice, you see that there's a lot of unlearning of gendered norms that are happening. These women are, of course, equipped with technical training, awareness about rights, and financial literacy. So the intersection of these two kind of leads to their valuing as solar engineers. So side by side with the training that these women get, there is also a change in the attitude of the community. So it's this whole process actually enables community conscientization and also in a way sustainability of the program, because if the program just focused on training women as solar engineers, it would have just become another scheme which probably dies down after a few years. But here there are these chain of factors and the benefit of the cross sectoral network that has been made, which kind of sustains the program. So despite all these efforts, there's still been a lot of challenge for the women, especially with regard to gendered norms. One of the challenge that I would like to mention is defaulting in the payment. So in return for the services that are paid to the solar mamas, the community members are expected to pay a fee. to the solar mamas, which kind of becomes their income in addition to the income that they receive from the government. But there have been many instances where a lot of households just stop paying, and they are legally allowed to uninstall the systems within 3 months of a default in payment. However, this has been very challenging because sometimes the batteries are kept inside the bedrooms, or spaces that are generally described as masculine in a Sansibari household, as a result of which, despite having the legal permission to uninstall, they've not been really able to do that. So these kind of challenges do exist, but however, overall there are a lot of changes in attitudes and positive changes in norms. So this is actually a really good example of looking at how transitions can be reimagined as an opportunity for transformation, focusing on relations between different actors, focusing on implicit and historically embedded gendered norms, and to place technology in a socio-economic and cultural context that kind of benefits all. So I would like to stop by again emphasizing a few central questions when we're talking about transitions. It's very crucial to understand who is transitioning and who is left behind. And how do we ensure that those who are left behind are also part or are also included? And this includes articulating a different vision, maybe a feminist and decolonial vision of energy transitions, which also calls from stories from the majority world to be told differently and not just as case studies of vulnerability, but also to showcase the agency that is and the transitions that are happening there. Yeah, I would like to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Kavya. That was really a treat, and I think both for Shayan and me, especially having gone to the Barefoot College, sort of the home of it in Colonia on our field work, it's also really riveting to dwell on your reflections, and I look forward to that engagement. We do have Carlos Dornell with us now. Welcome, Carlos. And I see that you're all ready to rumble, so we will. I suggest you put it on to full screen.
There we go.
So, yeah.
Yes.
Perfect.
Can you see the presentation? Yeah. Right.
Yes, we can.
Brilliant. Okay. So I can see you, but feel free to interrupt me at any point. Thank you very much, Kavya, for that presentation. That was very interesting. Thank you, Shayan and Siddharth, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I apologize for being a bit late. I had some issues with the internet and had to move places, but well, thankfully it all sorted out, and now I'm here. Okay, so I'll just go on with it. Yeah, so I think this presentation will follow very nicely to what Kavya just said. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I understand they already read my bio. Thank you very much for that, Shayan, Siddharth. I would just say that I will try to focus now on talking about a broader theoretical perception of like why do we need to decolonize the concept or the idea of energy justice. I would say that we have come to a point that energy justice has become a plastic concept. Let's say it's sort of like what happened to sustainability over other words that become useful in the moment through epistemic extraction and through different words, various forms of injustice. The notion of energy justice has now become, I think, a little bit messy. And I think we need to sort of think through if we really need or should we continue to talk about energy justice. I will, of course, try to explain why throughout this presentation. And I would advocate that we transition towards what I'm calling here pluriversal fairness. So yeah, I'll try to not be too theoretical, although I do have some theoretical input, but I also will complement this throughout the presentation with some insight from fieldwork research that I did for my PhD. So okay, so if we start from a theoretical perspective, right? What is energy justice? I think the last years, this 2023 marked the 10-year anniversary of the first, what they call energy justice paper that was published 2013. The whole conception about energy justice, adding these three particular circles that you see here: distributed, recognition, and procedural justice. And the whole idea, well, was that we can take these tenets from environmental justice, and by adding these other few, cosmopolitan and restorative justice, energy justice has become this burgeoning concept that has, it created a bunch of literature around it. It has incited a lot of people to think about energy justice, as I say here, as a whole energy systems approach, that is to look at it at the entire energy systems, not just to focus on production, consumption, etc., but to focus on supply chains, how are energy systems organized, as Kavya was saying just a moment ago, who wins and who loses from these perspectives, how are injustices embedded within the system itself. And of course, I think that the whole notion of energy justice draws on this idea of talking about energy as a right to, right? So for example, think about how people think about right access to energy, access, guaranteeing a certain percentage of sustainability, equity, and sufficiency, right? So the whole notion would be to think about how are we granting people access or a right to these types of justice. Of course, I could explain a little bit of what each circle is, but I'll just do it really quickly, right? So distribution is who gets to bear the burden of the cost, right? Once we move away from one energy from another, let's say energy system to another, who bears the cost of that transition? Recognition is recognizing otherness into the system, that is recognizing other forms of thinking, doing, being, right? Restorative would be like to mend past mistakes that the energy system already did and try to solve them through the adoption of policy or whatever other instrument. Procedural would be what we call participation, and the cosmopolitan would be simply to recognize this is a very liberal principle of like if you have injustice in one place, it's also related to injustice in other places. So we should all move towards let's say a just future for everyone. That's a very nice, and of course, who would disagree with this, right? It would be insane just to say like this is wrong. My point is, and the first critique that I would like to make here is that energy is seen as an abstract category, and I think this is really problematic because if we just think about energy as a resource, we reduce it, as I say here, to an abstract thermodynamic interchangeable commodity. And labor that can easily be exchanged and detached from its place of origin. I'm drawing this from, for example, Anna Singh or Jaume Franquesa, who has done a brilliant work in Catalonia. Then we are thinking energy as completely abstract entity, right? It can be interchangeable. It is required for us to grow, to develop, to move forward our progress, to decarbonize, etc., right? But if we really think of what energy means, I think we are missing other forms of understanding energy in relation to place, in relation to the context, or the historical context in which we are, in relation to struggles in the ground, to what is happening or what has happened to people historically in particular places, right? So if we just think of energy in these terms, as I say here, it becomes measurable, quantifiable, it becomes genderless, right? It's just a form of work, and hence is the energy of the homo economicus, right? Of this idea of progress, development that is embedded into us as a subjectivity. So how can we think about energy in a different conception? As I say here, you can see this is the Ius of Tehuantepec there with the neocolonialismo sign. And of course, this new reconfiguration of maps around, for example, solar potentials in Africa, etc. So if we think about energy in different terms, how would this look like? I really like this quote. It's from Blanca Charcosa. She's from Ecuador. This was quoted by Larry Lochman, but I think it's worth repeating here. For example, with the deception of development, they pollute rivers and cut down forests. But this does not add, but takes away energy, right? She's talking about, for example, if you create a hydropower dam, if you use forest wood to create energy, this doesn't create energy, but takes away life and leaves diseases and imbalances. When the river is polluted in the name of energy transition, energy is lost, the territory is lost, and the community is lost. Therefore, we subtract and not add. Right? So even if we add abstract energy to the system, we are subtracting other forms of energy, life works, processes of living with the territory in relation to nature, different understandings of what nature is and how we relate to it, right? So I think, hence, the first thing we should do is critique and try to understand energy not as an abstract category, but as a relational concept. The second one, of course, and drawing is from the first one, is that justice remains rooted in a notion of modernity. And what do I mean by that? I think scholars continue to treat energy and justice uncritically, as they it's largely defined through Western ways of thinking, right? So, for example, scholars in energy justice assume that justice can be delivered through the state, through the institutions, through energy policy, and they normally downplay other conditions in which energy policy operates, which is the local, historic, and spatial contexts, as well as the assessment of capitalist modernity, right? I think that this is because energy justice has become too overly positivistic and affirmative. By that I mean it affirms the actually existing context in which it is deployed, right? So it's assumed that people want development, that people want progress, that people want more energy, and there's like a necessity of granting access and more energy to everybody uncritically, right? That is the bottom line. So it's excessively and exclusively sometimes relying on policymakers, experts, and managers, right? It assumes that people will do the right thing and that they can make informed choices, right? But basically, what it ends up boiling down into is to an universalized one-size-fits-all form of energy justice, right? This is what, for example, the World Bank or all of these institutions, even the UN, argue in the Sustainable Development Goals that they would like to promote. I think I'm not saying that people shouldn't have access to energy, of course. What I'm trying to say is that this is assumed as a universal conception of what is needed, right? And I think that ends up in these types of projects that I put in here, right? This assumption that we can just move towards other forms of energy without critically understanding what is meant by development, what are the costs of that development, and what is the epistemical, I think going back to what Gabi was saying a moment, what is the epistemics and the ontologics of this particular way of doing things, right? What is the world that is put over others, and what are the forms of thinking that are discounted through these forms of energy transition? So what's on the other side of this assumption of modernity is what we will call the colonial matrix of power. This, of course, is very theoretical. I'll just go through this really quickly. Basically, the whole notion is that modernity was created with the other side of the coin being coloniality. So we can't understand modernity without coloniality. And I think that the way coloniality operates, according, of course, to all of these thinkers, is through this notion of coloniality of power, right? The institutionalization of hierarchies, of a Western modern way of thinking that discounts other forms of doing, being, and existing, right? So, for example, this is not exclusive from a colony. It's embedded into a particular states, independent states. So it's a form of internal colonialism. It's a reproduction of that colonial system that operated. So I would say, following, for example, what Alexander Dunlap also says, that the state is a continuation of that colonialism. It is internal colonialism, right? So what Frantz Fanon, Nelson Maldonado Torres would add to this is that there's also a coloniality of being, right? The mechanisms of subjectivation of life, body, and mind of the colonized. We don't need the actual colonizer there. Of course, this is a different context in settler colonial context, right? But even in places that are apparently independent or have not been colonized physically, after a very long time, there is still a coloniality of being that is embedded into the minds of people, how people act, right? This is the notion of development, I think is the best example, right? How we continue to act in the same narrative of development. Mignolo would then add that there's also coloniality of knowledge, right? The domination of European knowledge and symbolic systems over non-European other ones, which is, it discounts other ways of thinking, of doing, of knowing, right? And then Lugones, which I think this is a very important thing that was missing from the original conception of the coloniality of the colonial matrix of power, is a coloniality of gender, right? There's an institutionalization of hierarchies and organizing principles of exploitation that are embedded into how we think about coloniality, about the bodies, women, and nature, for example. So we need to take into account this system as well. So all of that to say that we should think about energy justice as what we could call a modern problem, right? The conception of justice is built on a Western-centric notion of progress, well-being, and sustainability. It adheres to what Bruno Latour would say a modern constitution Latour was only talking about this separation of nature and culture, which is the ontological separation, which I think is embedded in the core of modernity. But I would add two other layers to this, which is a teleological progress, or the notion of teleological progress, this idea that we should always strive to move forward, progress, growth, development, never stopping, and always more. That's also enrooted in that notion of modernity. And there's also a very narrowly defined sense of universalism, right? It's Western-centric, is what the colonial scholars would call the hubris of 0 point. That is, European, Eurocentric knowledge, Western knowledge, whatever you want to call it, is at the top. And from there is a 0 point. We can then think about the rest, and basically they are always below, right? So if we defined everything as this universal conception, then from there we would discount everything that is not or is not sensing this particular way of thinking, doing, right? So these three things are, I think, embedded into energy justice, and hence perhaps what we could do to sort of move away from this notion is to think energy justice cannot be seen as a universal project, right, as a right to, but instead as a right for. And I think this is, very semantic distinction, but sort of like gives some bit of the clues of what I'm trying to go to and what I will go to from here, right? Right to is I have a right to access, I have a right to sustainability, I have a right to equity, I have a right to. So it's a demand. It creates nouns, it creates dependencies on institutions, on ideas that need to grant me that. It disempowers my possibility of doing things. A right for, on the other hand, creates verbs, right? It moves from nouns with great dependency to verbs who depend actions, individual actions or community actions, people's actions that move away from this notion, right? So I think what we need to do is move understand energy as a right for a, let's say, transition, a right for a different form of eating, being, doing, living, inhabiting, etc., right? The problem, of course, and this is what I've written a little bit about, these are a few articles there, is that the problem is that the energy justice scholars continue to disavow the way social movements and these other forms of thinking about energy and justice exist. They simply think, of course, this is not all of energy justice scholars, but the majority and the mainstream, of course, of what has proliferated in the literature, continue to argue for this idea that we should speak directly to policymakers, we should appeal to corporate interest, and we should actually move away from this problematic past of like social movements, disobedience, all of that. We should discount it. It's just better to simply go directly to the people who make the decisions and talk to them and argue that they should make the right decisions, right? So I think if we really take this into consideration, I think then there is a problem with how energy justice has been embedded by the literature. It has completely removed itself from what is happening on the ground, thinking in more theoretical, abstract concepts, as I was saying. So, and for example, one of the key ideas is that these ideas of human rights, right? There's just an assumption that why should we be against human rights? It would be insane, right? But the whole notion here is that even the human rights conception is anchored on this idea of the modern constitution of what it means to be human, right? A modern conception of the human. And if you read, for example, Sylvia Wynter would argue that the modern conception of the human is built on the actual discounting of what is not human. So it had to be created against non-humanness. And I think that is one of the things we also need to come into a critique of modernity itself if we want to really talk about energy justice. So if we ignore the colonial roots of, for example, recognition of all of these forms of modernity, the late liberal governmentality, or even the separation of the different worlds that exist out there, and we simply assume that it can be done through modernity, what we are doing is affirming a modern project rather than rejecting it. And I think that is the main problem here, right? So I'll tell you really quickly, I have about 10 minutes, I'll just go through some of the things that I've done on the fieldwork of how this is taking place, for example, in Mexico, where I did my fieldwork, and some places in Latin America. So just a quick note on the methodology of what I did. Since, of course, I did this during the COVID pandemic, it was quite difficult to actually do proper ethnography and things that I planned originally. But I adopted this notion of militant research from a distance, right? So the questions that move this idea is how do we maintain solidarity with places in struggles, right? To increase collective, emancipatory political power. How do we impact what happens, on the ground not when the research is published, not through the impact of the research itself, but through the process of the research, right? How can we empower movements and help support the idea of actual decolonization on the ground, right? So this is a counter to the decolonization trend in academia, right? That detaches movements from theory. The whole idea would be to, I would say, reject activism and instead fully embody ourselves into how we can support and struggle and movements. So what is grounded here is political affinity, grounded political struggle as the main point. And even, of course, this is not measured in big changes like revolutionary stuff or anything like that. It will be measured in what can change in small-scale, relational, affective, or even material terms in whatever context they are applied. So yeah, just a few references there of how can we do things as, for example, this book by Timo Bartholis in Spanish, but I think it's brilliant, right? Think about science as a tool for struggle. So my first entanglement with this was in the peninsula of Yucatan. You can see here, this is on the right, where you can see the Tren Maya there. This is a reconfiguration of the territory that the Mexican government is doing. And interestingly, they're doing it in the name of sustainability. So my whole point was to think about, can we think of energy justice in a context where total extraction has become the norm, right? I think extraction has become ontological. So green extractivism would be the latest stage of material extraction, basically a form of pacification, legitimation to manage dissent and manufacture consent in the name of sustainability, of decarbonization, of transition, So I think what this has made is a new reconfiguration of territories, of places, of land through a geopolitical lens, creating new green frontiers for extraction. And I think that when we applied the liberal framework of energy justice, it basically operates as a tactic for inclusionary control, right? Because it lacks this decolonial critique, it lacks this approximation of a critique of the modern constitution. What it basically does is it's deployed as a tool to enroll people into this, let's say, green normative subjectivity, right? People receive the windmills, the wind parks, they receive the solar farms, and basically what they are told is this is in the name of sustainability, of development, of decarbonization. So it's necessary, it's good, it's not as bad as the other polluting industries. There are also more interrelations between other actors, right? Between governments, let's say private entities, but this is the language that is used to convince people, right? So what is seen here is that you can see, for example, some of the findings here is that the peninsula became the new powerhouse of Mexico. As you can see, this is the speculation of land that has happened around the Maya train. And these are all housing projects, solar projects, wind farms, different sustainable ways of doing things. And it's just a way of creating this new frontier of wasted empty spaces that can be absorbed into this system of production of greenness, right? So I would say it's a continuation of these colonial histories of Christianizing, civilizing, democratizing, and development, right? So if we think about energy from that perspective, you can see a coloniality attached to the energy system itself. I would say that if we think of it in terms of universal justice, right, from below, then energy can be seen as relational and as a challenge to this particular normativity. So that's one of the first things that I found. The second one is that there's a new emerging paradigm of energy justice coming from below, right? If we challenge this notion that it should come from policymakers, from the state, from the actual movements, from the top. If we think about the actual movements on the ground, then we can start to think of a different political economy of the transition, right? For example, I think that political economy asks some relevant questions, right? What is energy for whom? But it has still a very awkward relationship with capitalism, for example, around finance, around markets, and transition of being, right? I think the new political economy, as Abramsky said in a book quite a long time ago, I think 2010, he was saying it should be led by those affected by the energy transitions, right? So looking beyond the liberal state-centric approaches, we can think of those who are on the ground, as the Zapatistas would say, the many belows that can concrete a different way of understanding a relation to energy. So these spaces where energy is reconceptualized, I think offer another possibility of thinking how we can change those possibilities. This is a documentary which I really recommend. It's on YouTube. It's called The Energies of the People, which basically discusses this point very thoroughly. And it's in Spanish, but it's got subtitles. So I would really recommend you looking at this. It's 3 different cases from Latin America and Mexico who have done this particular thing from the ground and from the struggles from below. So yeah, so the whole notion would be, how can we think about decolonizing the energy transition, right? Confronting the coloniality of these energy systems entails recognizing how energy systems were and still are shaped by modern forms of colonial oppression, right? We do not start a transition from a notion of justice, but for actually existing injustice, right? So we need to think about those injustices that exist and the new ways that that coloniality can operate in the transition, right? So for example, think these are the maps from the World Bank. They show the potentiality of solar and wind in Latin America, but I think they also show the new frontiers of extraction that are continually expanding through a notion of what Alexander Dunlap would call infrastructural colonialism, right? Taking advantages of the superabundance of wasted spaces that can be applied. So if we think about how the colonial matrix of power continues to operate through the notion of energy justice, I think we can see that notions of to modernize, to develop, to continue progress and development in the South would function as an apparatus for this late liberal form of governmentality, right? This idea that we can just simply integrate the difference into the existing system of capitalism without actually changing it. I think the challenge of energy justice is to think of energy justice from below as a transition away from it. And now I have a couple of more slides here, but I know I'm running a little bit short on time. So if you just grant me this one, I'll try to explain how this transition of energy justice, how to decolonize energy justice would look like, right? So if we have this as the main basis, right? This is the original framework: distribution, recognition, and procedures. And if you do this correctly, if you recognize distributed harm, if you recognize people within the existing policy frameworks or the decision-making process, and you make them participate correctly, what you would get is energy justice. What I would say is that the decolonial critique would say that actually, when you think about distribution, you're not thinking of how you distribute harm to others, right? How, for example, when you say you recognize people, you may actually be speaking for others, and how when you think they are participating, you are misrecognizing their subjectivities, what they really want, because you're incorporating them into an already embedded framework that assumes modernity, development, progress, right? So if we take that decolonial critique into account, then how can we reformulate this? Decolonial scholars have written about this. For example, Leah Temper has done it in the terms of environmental justice, and Lina Alvarez and Brendan Kunzait have done the same. If we can apply this, I think, to the same, to the idea of energy justice, which would mean we can reformulate what distribution means instead by destabilizing this dualism between nature and culture, right? If we take into account that there's a different way of relating to the world, which means that we shatter this ontological distinction, then we can actually see who gets harmed and how by this framework. If we think about cognitive justice, which I think is the epistemic justice that Kavya was talking about a moment ago, sort of also and enables people to be recognized under their own terms. So instead of recognition, of participation, of consultations, it's more about self-determination, right? And I think this is the last one, the procedural point. When you think about how people actually can create their own practice for existing in the world that in the way they want to be, right? So that is, I think, what it's meant by pluriversal fairness. This idea that we should interrupt what is embedded as a status quo. We should demand epistemic justice as a way of thinking of how people are recognized and embedded into a particular system or a rejection of that system itself. And we should think about, instead of procedural participation forms, about grounded normativity. That is how people operate in the ground, right? What is rooted in the particular territory in that particular context. So I think this is what I would call pluriversal fairness, right? And this is the last slide. I'll finish with it, sorry. In its current form, energy justice can only operate within the capitalist system, right? It is stuck within this iron cage of the modern constitution, these three tenets that I was talking about. So if we redefine energy justice, it is rooted to the particularities of the territories, and it is built on a universal negation. So not a universal project of like everything should have development, progress, development, but a rejection of that idea of one singular world, which creates many openings to other onto epistemic practices, other worlds, other knowledges, other forms of being. So I think a sense of grounded normativity that is a place-based practice rooted in a rebellious quotidianity against this universal project is what should inform energy justice. There is no universal project of energy justice. There is only a grounded project based on these particular relations to the ground, to nature, to history, and to context, right? The colonial practice is not a metaphor. It entails a struggle from below, a recognition of awareness, and a dialogue between these multiple alternatives, right? This is what I would think is the pluriversal transition that would enable us to think of energy justice as a thing that would emerge from the many belows. And yeah, I'll stop right there because I know I'm on time. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Alice. Yeah, a real treat that as well. And I think I will soon pass over to Shayan to lead us through any questions and discussion, also from people online. Here, I encourage everybody to just sort of speak up if you have anything to put forward. But I will say that just passing over to Shayan, I will say that there are some. This is an evolving discussion, right? There are several sets of reflections emerging along the lines you've really drawn out very evocatively, Carlos. And one of the things that we've on the asset project and also more generally been kind of going back and forth on in these past years is, to what extent is this a balancing act? To what extent do we need to not have sort of an either or, but maybe both and sort of things? So are there, fora, are there occasions when mobilizing energy justice in a particular kind of framing that is more policy oriented, that is more mid-range rather than overtly critical, that's sort of engaging with different kinds of others, even if one doesn't agree on sort of all basic principles? To what extent is there a case to be made for that as some sort of pragmatic, realist sort of engagement, which doesn't, eschew the possibility of also having this more pluralized kind of epistemological, ontological commitment and pursuing some of these more critically informed ends through means that you've put forward as pluriversal fairness here. So is there room for sort of everything under a big tent, or is there necessarily a reason to exclude one, or we pay sort of a bigger price? So with that, I'll pass over. So not letting you respond, Carlos, but just holding that thought in suspended animation. I will give the floor to Shayan, perhaps to start by responding and then take us through the discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Sid, for moderating the conversation so far. And Carlos and Kavya, thank you so much for really engaging talks. Hopefully it'll generate a lot of thoughts and other follow-ups. I want to, I guess, begin with, I have one question for each of you before opening the floor, but I thought I would add on what Sid was just talking about earlier, because my question to you, Carlos, is along similar lines. And then maybe we can move over to my second question. And that's kind of, thinking about the levers of power and where is it that you kind of, if, as an engaged scholar, where is it that you engage with the discussion and debate? Is it, because as you mentioned, the state form itself is colonial, right? Does that mean that we disengage from policy work and reform-oriented efforts because that is itself a form of delegitimating and a form of resistance and has value in that way? Is it on working towards autonomous federations and the kind of more of an anarchist tradition? Or is it through engaging in defiant scholarship, right? Like the works of that are advocated by Walter Rodney, through guerrilla intellectuals and et cetera. Kind of where do you, how do you navigate, I guess, through some of these?
Very interesting. Thank you, Shayan. Thank you, Siddharth, for those questions. Yes, of course, I am being, I think, critical, which is fair to say. But I think the discussion that I'm trying to sort of encourage is to think that each context is different, right? So, for example, it's not the same if we think about energy justice in Europe, If we think about it in terms of, I don't know, Luxembourg, I'm being ridiculous here, of course. If we think about it in Luxembourg, or we think of it in Mexico, right? The whole transition notion is different. But the problem is that we assume that it's not. And that is my critical thing, right? SDGs are a universal agenda that basically assumes that everybody should follow the same pattern, regardless of what happens. You know? That is ludicrous to me. It doesn't make any sense. So yes, I am being critical and trying to sort of struck a punch to that idea. But what I would say is that my particular assumption with the state is that the state is there. We cannot ignore that the state exists, of course. But for example, in Latin America, we have a very, very grounded tradition of what the state can actually do to decolonize or to transition, to transform reality. Look at Ecuador, look at Bolivia, look at even Mexico, Venezuela, what we call the pink tide, these progressive leftist governments who came, you know, with radical intellectuals, Garcia Linera, who was a guerrillero. He was one of the most decolonial prominent scholars in Latin America. He became vice president, and he basically, halfway through his vice presidency, he said, capitalism is unavoidable. You know, so the state will need to transition through capitalism, and we will try to decolonize through it. It didn't happen, you know. Even if they integrated OMBB and they got the rights of nature into the constitutions, which Mexico didn't go that far. But even if they did that, the state has a limit in what it actually can do to decolonize. So that what I would say is like maybe the relationship to the state is different, as I said, not the same in Europe, not the same in India, not the same in Mexico, not the same in, you know. But the relationship to the state should be prefigurative. We cannot avoid the relationship with the state. I agree with that. There is policy that can be helpful. You know, I will say this is very traditional cliche thing, but Nancy Fraser, for example, in his notion of non-reformist reform, I think is a nice prefigurative concept that would enable us to think about how we deal with the state, right? We should think, what is this policy for? Is it to affirm the actual existing injustice of modernity, or is it to shatter it, to move it, to shake it, to sort of piece by piece deconstruct it? This is what I would mean. For example, I'll just give you a quick example and I'll stop. If you think about, if you do a policy reform, let's say in Mexico, that enables you to think about decentralized, democratizing energy justice at a local level, creating new forms of ownership for energy systems, that is prefigurative. Because in the long run, that reform will let you move away from the notion of the state. It will empower different people's conceptions, communities, identities, forms of existing, of relating to that particular place, embedded in that particular reality, instead of thinking that the state should transition away through renewables, large scale, because fossil fuels are bad, etc. You know what I mean? So this is prefigurative. This would allow us to think of a future where the state becomes less prominent. And that would be my answer, sorry.
Thanks. Yeah, I especially like the kind of example that you gave at the end to kind of ground this in energy. For example, how engaging with and trying to bring about community energy or better community energies, in a way seems reformist for engaging with policy and the state, et cetera, so forth, but enables alternative futures that can kind of be the flowering of many different politics of decentralization and decision making on different scales, and independence. Great, thanks for that. Kavya, moving to something you brought up, I think as Sid also mentioned earlier, I visited the Barefoot College in Rajasthan and Tilonia, where the movement started back, I believe, in the 70s it was. And there's something I've been thinking about kind of since, and that's to some extent on how does it stay relevant for the future of energy, one, and then two, I guess maybe let me first explain this before getting to the second part. And that's, for example, a lot of the projects that they were working on in terms of energy. I mean, they do a lot of other things in terms of water access and other crafts, etc. In terms of energy, was limited to, say, household electrification. Right? This is like one or two lamps, ability to charge your phone. And also it's kind of often contextualized, at least the narrative around it, and doesn't necessarily have to be the case. But the way it is that these are in a way temporary until the national grid gets there, until there is decentralized microgrids and mini grids where people have more access to electricity for provision of various needs. So kind of how can it be a movement that can enable kind of desirable alternative energy futures that are more than just what is seen as maybe being temporary fixes because of undesirable current conditions? And I mean, this is a difficult question, right? But something I thought maybe you also might have thought about. The second one is like having conversations with how they receive funds. A lot of it is through government agencies, and a lot of it is them to writing grants to companies like Microsoft and Apple, etc., and trying to get CSR money to be able to fund these solar panels, etc. So in a way, it's not independent of the state form of capitalism more broadly, especially, but in a way survives through it or with it. And do you see ways in which these how can essentially movements like the Barefoot College that are doing imperative work in a lot of different domains kind of be a countervailing force as opposed to and be able to survive basically in the current political economy? Sorry for a difficult question if it feels that way.
Yes, Shayan, thank you for these questions. Yeah, I definitely thought about these too. But first, I would like to start by saying that I think the Barefoot College in Zanzibar is much more successful than the original one in Tilonia. And yeah, you're right that, with the extension of the grid, especially in Zanzibar, probably the relevance of this is being questioned. But at least in Zanzibar, it started with also the idea of reducing gender-based violence, which was very common in Zanzibari society. So, I mean, hand in hand with the idea of electrifying villages was also the very strong incentive to trouble the gendered norms that were existing in the society. And one difference here is that the state is a very active agent here, and that I don't know, cross actor network, which is formed in Zanzibar, does not necessarily exist in India, is what I understand, because I don't think the state in India, I mean, of course, the Ministry of External Affairs in India is supporting it, but it's not really having strong connections with the local government bodies, or at least the state is not an active agent here. So, coming back to what Carlos was also talking about, the role of the state, but one danger that I think with locally led transitions is that it sometimes lets the state off the hook. And this kind of then becomes a very excellent way of bringing in neoliberal governance strategies, and kind of the state shying away from its basic responsibilities. So in Zanzibar, there is a lot of thought about this. In fact, I had also interviews with government representatives who were concerned about this, and they were thinking of a larger program which kind of will electrify the whole household, and not just the small scale at which they're doing it now. So at least in Zanzibar, there's a lot of incentive to sustain the program, as opposed to India, where the studies show that many of the women now, they don't even work as solar engineers because it's done. Their job is done, and basically they're not called for to continue doing the services in the villages. And the problem there is that the college kind of tries to manage these problems alone. Of course, there are funds coming in, but still, they don't have an active partner. Whereas here, it's every process that they do, there are two government representatives always with the team. So this, I think, this kind of partnerships are very crucial for the sustenance of these programs. Because when you talk about grassroots movements, it's not new in the majority world, right? The movements of resistance have always been there because of the different development challenges. But many of them were not able to be sustained or, scaled up, or at least get recognized. But this kind of I think what attracted me most in Zanzibar is this governance model that's in play there, which I believe will help in sustaining it a little more. Regarding funding, yes, I'm not sure how exactly. There is a lot of foreign funds coming in, but at least in Zanzibar, my impression is that it's also because the government is probably a little more stronger and a little bit autocratic, probably, that they have their own set agendas, so it's not necessarily tinkering in the way they operate. But there are dangers, of course. But at least so far, a lot of it's just like Carlos said, understanding the context in which the transition is brought about. So the success of Zanzibar is because of that. There's been a deep understanding of the cultural context there. And so that is why this whole idea of conscientization of men, bringing the community on board and having them play an active part in this whole process. So it's not just the women. So all these are important methods to ensure that the program is sustained. So when Sola Mama is trained, it's not just her, it's the village which comes with it. So that those kind of initiatives which tries to really engage with the communities is probably the way forward as well. So otherwise, as is happening in energy communities in Europe, there are a lot of critiques now on how they have also become very white male dominated, and gender or any intersectional perspectives are totally absent from energy communities, or say local action groups in Europe that kind of talk about development issues on a rural scale. So this kind of a danger that's hiding in this whole narrative of transitions, which is why it's important that just partnerships are formed, I would say. Yeah, I would like to stop there. If you have any questions, just feel free to.
No, yeah, thanks for elaborating further on those points. Yeah, I guess both on the context of re-emphasizing the context dependence nature of thinking through these things, and how interesting it is that same movement perhaps with many similar principles and priorities are being carried out in different contexts and trying to navigate through those unique circumstances. Yeah, I think on that note, I will. I see Sabina has a hand up already. Sabina, go for it.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I have two questions. So, Gavi, you touched a little bit upon it about who is to how like questions of accountability when it comes to locally led transitions. And I think with trying to get as many people as involved and trying to make the process as just as possible, the question of legitimacy, it becomes answered to a great extent, but then it kind of eludes accountability. So how do we balance that when we're talking about locally led transitions? Who is to account for when everyone is equally, I don't know, like powerful or whatever metric that we use there? And to Carlos, I was wondering, I mean, it was a very provocative presentation, and I was wondering, does it have to be so that we just, dismiss the concept of energy justice altogether? Are your critiques more from an outside-in perspective? And should we take a more inside-out perspective? And when we do a more embedded kind of research, then do those tenets of energy justice still hold true when it's done in a social-cultural aspect?
Yeah, I can start. Thank you for the question. Yes, I think, one way I would think about it is a relational lens. This is where the lens of care becomes important. So instead of asking who is accountable and attributing that responsibility to someone, which is again uh, a kind of notion that is developed in our thinking. If we think of it more as relations between individuals, relations of dependence and interdependence, there are also relations of power there. So if care is seen as a lens to look at these relations, probably uh, there's probably no need to attribute like a certain accountability to certain individuals. I mean, this is not to disregard the role of the state or the policy process, but still, I think seeing it all through a lens of relationality is probably a way to make sure that all voices are heard and efforts are made towards collective progress. Say, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that question. Yeah, I am deliberately provocative. I think we should have a critique, a sustained critique to what energy justice has done. And my critique is that it has just gone too far. I mean, if you actually read to find what these scholars have been writing, so scholars from the north, scholars who think that it's just better to talk to energy justice, to decision makers. I mean, they actually wrote that, and you can read them. It's basically saying like, hey, this problem, the whole problem with environmental justice is that they're dealing with these struggles on the ground. Like, why should we bother? That really, when I heard that and I read that, I just couldn't believe that they were writing that. So yeah, I think there is a need to push back on the whole notion of energy justice as this detached concept from the ground and completely removed from what is happening with social movements. I would say that it depends, right? I cannot say, yeah, just throw energy justice to the dustbin of history and just forget about it. I would say, in my context, in my perception, from what happened in the ground, from my studies in Yucatan, from what I've seen, energy justice is the worst case scenario. Is what you get if the policy more or less works, right? And that is just this superficial integration, this there's a brilliant way of calling it, this condescending hospitality of recognition, saying like, yes, we know you're different and you have a different way of seeing reality, but we will just tolerate that you exist. That's the best thing you get with energy justice. That's what I would say in my context. So for me, it doesn't make sense. It would mean pluriversal fairness, again, critiques the idea of justice from a modernity perspective and talks about a pluriversal that is a different opening to other worlds, other knowledges, other ways of being, relating to nature, to place, etc. So for me, it's a way better context. It's more logical, useful in this particular context. In Europe, for middle class people, I don't know. Maybe it doesn't make sense, But I think then my whole point here is that we should just move ourselves from this centered position of energy justice. I think there are other possibilities, and I think that is what needs to be critiqued. Yeah.
Thank you, Carlos. We have a question from one of our online participants, Marion.
Thank you for making time. I came a little bit late into the session, and so I heard mostly Carlos, and I really appreciate your tour de force of critique of energy justice, and I think there's a lot of validity to it. But I have some questions about your repeated use of the term "on the ground," because I think sometimes we might have a sort of very naive and romanticized version of what that might mean. I'm from Germany and I live in Norway, and what I'm seeing there is that when you talk to people on the ground, you're not somehow in a space that's not affected by populism, by right-wing agitation, by people that, like there is no, it's not some kind of space where people have, you really get what people, people's own agency. There's a lot of disinformation, there are conspiracy theories, all of that stuff. So I would like for you to talk a little bit more about that, because I don't think there's a pure space there to be gotten, just as, but I do think there's an absolute necessity. And just one anecdote from Norway, we have we had a energy crisis for a while here, and it really was about prices of energy. And we saw that each valley was after their own regional justice. For us, that means we want a just price. We want the lowest price, meaning that very often, or we want to benefit from the energy that we have, meaning the people downstream, the people in the next valley over, we charge them, So my question is also, how do you connect communities and make them also responsible to each other and not just to the one local group? Thank you.
Thanks, Mariam. That's a great question, and yeah, something that I've also tried to think through. Right, this idea that we are romanticizing the pluriverse, the localities, they're romanticizing indigenous cultures because they are, let's say, non-modern or contest modernity. I think I would draw, for example, on the Zapatista examples, on the different autonomous movements in Mexico, like the Acapatzingo. Well, I mean, there's several, but I could tell you the names. But basically, what they've done is it's a long process. It's a dialogue. It's a process that starts. What I mean from the ground is this localized process of community building struggle that strives for dignity and autonomy, right? So I think, for example, what happened to me is that I also, when I did the fieldwork in Yucatan, there's a big train doing there. I don't know if you know this, but Mexico is reformulating this territory to make it legible for extraction, basically. So basically, when people say well, what do you think about the train? They would say, yes, we want the train because we want progress, we want development, and that is the government language coming through their mouths, literally. No, we want development, we want progress, we want to be rid of poverty, which I think would translate similar to what's happening in Germany in some places with the right-wing conspiracies. It's not the same, again, the context changes, but it's similar, right? So what I would say is when I spoke to people a little bit more, they would start to think, well, why do you want development? Well, we're poor, we don't have opportunities, etc. But then if you press a little bit more, you see that they're not talking about development in the same way that the government is, or what they are referring to it. They are talking about well-being. They are talking about having certain securities that they have been dispossessed of historically, right? So when you scratch the surface a little bit, it's not necessarily that black and white, is what I would say. People do seem to want development sometimes, but if you just question them, is the definition they have of development, of what they really need, what they want, is very different. And I think that also sort of helps to move away from this movement of this, it's just black and white, or is it good or bad, or is it romanticized or not, which I think is legitimate. I'm not saying it's not. It's really useful to critique, because even in the pluriverse, there is conflict, there is disagreement, there will be problems. The problem is that if we just put one hegemonic vision overall, and then just to reject them, that is when you get these black and white discussions, for example, that what's happening with identity, what's happening with conspiracy theories, with the right-wing extremism. I think it's just a result of that particular way of framing. The pluriverse would add that then, yes, there will be communities who are hierarchical, who are misogynistic, who still have particular problems within them. I'm not saying that they're perfect, but what would happen is that the resolution of those conflicts would be different. It would
just mindful of time here. I will draw us over to Kavya, if you'd like to just share a minute of closing reflections, and also to Shayan, if you want to bring us around full circle, because we will wrap up in 2 minutes more. So Kavya, and Shayan.
And I'll just have a quick reflection on what Carlos said about, the difference in a community. So I think it's also that we need to provide a deliberative space where ideas can be contested, discussed, and co-created. That is also a possibility, a way of ensuring that there is accountability and progress actually made. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, many thanks to both of you, Carlos, Kavya, and also Sid for moderating. This is, yeah, we only have about a minute or so left, so not enough to take any more questions. But obviously lots remain to be discussed. Yeah, so thanks all for coming and participating. This was really nice and engaging, and I hope that get to meet you in person sometime, Carlos and Kavya.
I'd like to echo Shayan's gratitude, and I think we should have a little round of applause from the room for our speakers as well. Thanks again for taking the time to engage, and also I acknowledge that Shayan's really done a fantastic job of pulling this together. So thanks for doing that, and all the best for the evening. I'm sure we'll keep in touch and take these conversations forward in the many different ways that you're already contributing to this valuable work.
Thank you, Shayan. Thank you, Siddharth. And thank you, Kavya.
Yeah. See you guys around.
Thank
Cheers.
you. Yeah, see you. Bye.